Now, every Yom HaShoah, we remember the genocide of 6 million Jews, approximately 3 million killed in death camps, 1.3 million shot by SS units in occupied Ukraine, Russia, and Eastern Europe, and buried in mass graves, and 800,000 who died in the ghettos. The sheer number of victims is still difficult to fathom. But while I'm here to remember the Jews that died in the Holocaust and to share my father's story, I would also like to take a moment to honor the legacy of millions of non-Jewish victims who were murdered as well, to remember what others lost during the war. The Nazis considered Polish people to be racially inferior, and more than 1.5 million Polish civilians died during World War II. The Nazis executed priests, political leaders, officers in the army, teachers, doctors, and members of the intelligentsia. They kidnapped thousands of Polish children who were considered to have Aryan qualities and placed them in German homes. In the former Soviet Union, millions of Russian and Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war were killed. They were shot, starved to death, or died of disease. The Nazis also killed 250,000 Roma and 250,000 handicapped German citizens, and there were so many other victims as well. The Jews may have been at the top of Hitler's list, but we had company. With that, I'd like to tell you the story of my father, Gene. He was born on January 11th, 1933, in Tizovilak, a small ethnically Hungarian border town in what was then Czechoslovakia. He lived there with his two older sisters, Lily and Valerie, his parents, Fanny and David, and his dog, Bukshi. The town had a sizable Jewish population at the start of World War II. Approximately 1/3 of its 4,000 residents were Jews, and they enjoyed good relations with their Christian neighbors. Jewish and Christian children played together, swam together, and studied together, and my father had warm memories of his childhood. After the Nazis rose to power, Hungary aligned itself with Germany, and in 1938, Hungary annexed my father's village and surrounding area. Under its right-wing nationalist government, anti-Semitism became official government policy. Jewish business licenses were canceled, which prevented my grandfather from operating his leather business. Young Jewish men were drafted into labor battalions, and most were sent to do forced labor on the Eastern Front with the Soviet Union. Jews were subject to curfews, were forbidden from listening to radio or reading newspapers, and lived in constant fear and uncertainty. Children were not spared. The Hungarian equivalent of the Hitler Youth Group started in town and met several times a week in the school. The Jewish children were forced to clean the classroom after the youth group meetings ended. Some of my father's non-Jewish friends stopped playing with him. Their parents prohibited it because my father was a Jew. Others bullied my father, and my grandfather told him not to retaliate because my grandfather could end up in prison. So my father and his family endured these conditions for a few years. Although life was difficult, they were relatively fortunate compared to Jews from Poland and other countries. The Hungarians had been spared deportation and mass shootings, which had begun in other countries several years earlier. But in 1944, the Germans started the mass deportation and extermination of the Hungarian Jews. In March, the police went to my father's home and told his family to gather only what they could carry. They were being sent to a Jewish ghetto in the next day in a city called Nagyzolos. As they left their home the following morning, my father's family saw neighbors rush in to loot their home. And as they left town on large horse-drawn carts, a few hours later, dozens of townspeople cursed, shouted, and spat at them. After 2 or 3 weeks in the ghetto, my father, his family, and thousands of others were loaded onto cattle cars and taken to Birkenau, the largest camp at Auschwitz. It had been built for the purpose of eliminating all of Europe's remaining Jews. Several days later, exhausted and terrified, my 11-year-old father emerged from the train and stepped into a chaotic, hellish scene. thousands of disoriented, terrified people, armed SS guards, barking dogs, the unfamiliar smell of burning flesh. On the train platform, he and my grandfather were separated from his mother and sisters, and a prisoner that worked on the platform clearing the trains went up to my father, and he pointed to the chimneys and he said, "You see those? They are crematorium. That's where they burn the bodies. Whatever you do, stay with your father." A few minutes later, my father found himself in front of Dr. Mengele, infamous for horrific medical experiments at Auschwitz, who conducted the initial selection. A gesture in one direction meant the gas chambers, and a gesture in the other direction meant you were spared for the time being. Most were sent to the gas chambers. Let's listen to my father in his own words.
When I came before Mengele, so my slide built and everything told me to go this way. And I just want to stay with my father. And, he would not do two movements for one person. It's too much. So right away, a German was jumping for me. But like a miracle, one of the trucks that was fully loaded at this point with our belongings cut in front of me. And behind the cover of the truck, I run after my father, and way up to the front of the crowd, it was already the people who were allowed to go into the camp proper to be saved at that time, to say that was a reprieve line. And at that point, they didn't chase after me, and that's how I stayed alive at that point. Now, I was together with my father that first 2 days. The first night was the first day they went and they put us through some kind of a cleansing procedure where they shaved our hairs off everywhere, and they put us into they had some bottles there that would apply some kind of a chemical disinfectant to our genitals and to under the armpits. Now, those razors that those people who worked there, those prisoners that worked with, they are blunt and they actually ripped the pubic hairs and everything out of people's bodies. So when they put that chemical on, there was an excruciating stinging pain, which I fortunately didn't have to suffer because I was too young to have any of that problem. And then we were crammed into a big barrack. There was only standing room there. And at the most terrible night, the first night, no food, no nothing was given to us ever since we came off the train. And it was a terrible experience for me because I was right up against my father in my body. And I could feel my father's body shake, sobbing all night. And the next day, there was selection for working transports. And they were saying they're looking for this or that or the other. And my father wanted to stay for a little longer, didn't volunteer for any kind of a group to find out the lay of the land, what's happening. The next day, looking for a group of workers to be mechanics. So I said, I'm a mechanic, bicycle mechanic. I could only ride a bike that's got all the mechanics and mechanics. But they just pushed me aside and my father was separated from me.
So my father was on his own, just 11 years old, in a barrack holding 1,000 or more prisoners, hard labor for 10 to 12 hours every day, very little food and water. During daily roll call, prisoners were forced to stand motionless, sometimes for hours, and whoever moved or fell was sent to die. When possible, my father would go to a fence that separated his camp from my grandmother's. She and her 2 daughters made it through the first selection, and he would let his mother know that he was okay. One day, my grandmother told him that she met a man named Fritz. He was a prisoner at Birkenau, but like the man that first warned my father about the crematoria, Fritz worked in the Canada Commando and moved relatively freely throughout the camp. Because Fritz sorted and inventoried belongings from the trains, he and other members of the Canada Commando were able to take gold, jewelry, and other valuables and to use them to buy favors from the guards and German officers. My grandmother told my father that she gave Fritz some bread and Fritz would bring it to him. When Fritz met my father, he gave him the bread and said, "From now on, I will protect you." Fritz kept that promise. As transports brought more Jews in, the Germans needed to make room in the camp, and that meant more selections for the gas chambers. Because my father was so young, so small, and so obviously ill-suited for hard labor, he was in constant danger of being sent to the gas chambers. Within days of meeting Fritz, my father was sent for another selection before Mengele, this time on a field at the back of the camp near the train platform. A piece of wood was nailed at a certain height, and children were told to walk underneath. Anyone whose head did not reach the post was placed in a group destined for the gas chambers, and that's where my father was sent. Fritz was aware of the selection and stood nearby. My father, believing that he was heading to the gas chambers, called out to Fritz. Fritz told my father that he would take care of it. He paid off a guard and pulled my father from the group of children. A few weeks later, my father was selected again, and Fritz saved him again. My father's final selection occurred on September 17, 1944, the eve of the Jewish holiday of Rosh Hashanah. Here is how my father described it.
Selection came, but this time it was unexpected. This time there was a surprise selection. Again, they needed more room, we were eating too much food, we didn't work much. So Fritz was at the trains, and Mengele came, bim bam boom, we just picked out, and I was put into a barrack where they put the condemned kids for the crematorium. And it was 10 o'clock in the morning, and they did not give us any food in that place. All they got is tea. They didn't want us to defecate when we take to the gas chambers at night. Midnight they used to take us in the trucks to the gas chambers. So they wanted to keep us clean and neat. They don't need people. And around 6 o'clock, Fritz comes and he says, "Little boy, I'll get you out. Don't worry. I gotta talk to somebody, but I'll get you out." I said, "Okay. You want any food?" I said, "No." And the night was coming on, was getting darker and darker, and the scene in this barrack was, I think I'll always remember it. The kids started to act differently. They were contemplative, they reflected, they are sitting, some started to pray, others cried, some started to scratch their names into the wooden beds there, older beds. And I was waiting, and as the hours went on, I could see that I'm in trouble. It's 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and Fritz was nowhere. I said to myself, "Well, he just told me to be happy to feel that everything is okay, but I'm finished." So I started to make peace with myself also. I prayed, I told my family. And about 11 o'clock, Fritz comes. "Come on, little boy, you're out." And he, of course, he fixed that. With a German, that only one should be counted in that place, and I should be counted. As long as the tally was good, everything was fine. And there was some kind of barricade in front of the gate, the door which was guarded by 2 Germans, that I always had to walk over, had to climb up and lift it over by Fritz. And as I was climbing up, I had this surge of boys, my friends from my hometown, reach for me. "Gene, take me with you. Help me." And he said, and one boy said to me, he's on another picture there, he said, "Tell my mother how I died." And other little things like that yelled at me. And as I was being pulled up, they pulled off my shoes. And I was pulled away, and I was saved.
The boy that pulled my father's shoes off was his best friend, who was also named Gene. The next morning, my father had written a note. He wrapped it around a rock, and he threw it to Gene's sister, whose name was Tilly, and that's how Tilly learned that her brother died. All of the boys selected that night, around 1,000 of them, were killed. At this point, my father had tuberculosis and was very weak, and Fritz moved him to a hospital barrack. He checked on him regularly because the Germans cleared out and killed hospitalized inmates. After a few days there, Fritz came again and said that it was too risky for my father to stay in the hospital barrack, and he arranged for my father to be transferred to Camp E. A couple of weeks later, Fritz said that it was becoming too difficult to protect my father in Birkenau, and he arranged for him to be placed onto a work transport that was headed to Braunschweig, an industrial city in Germany that used thousands of slave laborers during the war. So in November 1944, my father found himself in a camp in Braunschweig, sometimes called Schillstrasse, that housed the prisoners that worked at the Bussing truck factory. My 11-year-old father had to sort nuts and bolts on an assembly line, and when he wasn't working quickly enough, he was beaten by guards. At Braunschweig, there was no threat of gassing, but the Germans and their capos starved and mistreated the prisoners. When it was mealtime, the sadistic camp commander, Max Kirstein, instructed the guards to throw potatoes on the ground so they could watch and laugh as the emaciated prisoners scrambled and fought for food. My father was small and sick and often had nothing to eat. The conditions at Braunschweig were terrible. The prisoners wore the same filthy uniforms that they had on their backs when they arrived from Auschwitz. They were not allowed to bathe and were infested with lice. My father had sores all over his body, and his wooden shoes caused an infected lesion on his ankle. It was very difficult for him to even walk. But my father endured. He said that although he was treated like an animal all day, he would remind himself of his humanity at night. He would talk to himself and say, "You're a boy. You're a human being." He thought about his family and his friends, and he cried, quietly. My father was at Braunschweig until March 1945, when Allied air raids eventually stopped all work at Bussing. By this time, approximately 30% of the prisoners had died of starvation, typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases. On March 26th, my father and the other remaining prisoners had to walk 20 kilometers to the next camp, Wattenstadt. My father was in terrible shape. He was skeletal, his tuberculosis made it difficult to breathe, and because of the lesion on his ankle, he could barely walk. Thankfully, 2 adult prisoners held him up and helped him survive the march to Wattenstadt. After a week or two there, the prisoners were loaded onto a train and spent days winding through Germany, eventually arriving at Ravensbrück, which had been a women's camp. There, a Red Cross delegation came and provided food packages to the prisoners, the first real food my father would eat in months. The provisions included canned meat and fish, cheese and powdered milk, and cigarettes. Somehow, my father instinctively knew that he would have trouble digesting the meat, and he traded his meat and cigarettes for cheese and crackers. By the next morning, a number of prisoners had died. Starved, they ate all their provisions as quickly as they could, and they died from acute diarrhea. On April 24th, the prisoners were evacuated again and were heading toward Hamburg. The Swedish Red Cross had struck a deal that in exchange for provisions for the Germans, the prisoners would be sent to Sweden. But an Allied bombing damaged the train tracks, and the train had to return to Ravensbrück. Eventually, on April 27th, my father was transferred to Wobelin, his final camp. At this point, the war was nearly over. The American army was closing in, and the Germans knew it was only a matter of days. But their cruel treatment of the prisoners continued, and every morning there were more and more dead prisoners placed in piles in the camp. My father's condition was very serious, but he knew the American soldiers were close, and he could taste freedom. Every morning, the sight and sound of an American or British plane that circled above the camp lifted his spirits. On May the 1st, the Germans forced all the prisoners onto a train, and they stayed there overnight. My father described that night as one of the worst he had experienced during the war. He said that in order to breathe, you had to get close to the grates on the ceiling of the train, and the only way to get close to the ceiling of the train was to stand on the bodies of those that had died earlier in the day. The next morning, The Germans attached a locomotive and evidently were preparing to take the train to either Hamburg or Lübeck. But an Allied plane appeared, and here is my father recounting what happened.
And as he was coming to couple up to the train, we hear this zooming, swooping down of the airplane. And machine gun fire. The train, of course, with a steam locomotive. And he shot across, almost sawed the engine in half, losing the water and the steam. That was the end of that. Unfortunately, as the train lurched forward, the first two cars, I think, some of the people were in there. The last one, he got their imprisonment, they were killed. But he was still a good shot. He really did a job, and we're safe. And then the Germans came and told us to get out of the car and back into the camp. And I would say half of us stayed there, dead, in that boxcar that night. We went to the camp, and then we look around. The braver ones went out to the soldiers, you stay in your barracks and don't move from there. And there was a little time there for about 4 hours between the time we came out of the train and the time the first American soldiers, paratroopers, came into our camp. There was a little bit of a no authority, sort of. And we started getting braver and going out and going into foraging, kind of see what we can do, what we can get organized. I found a coat that was far too large for me. I slit the lining of it, and I made like a coat, like hard coat has, you know, where he puts everything in the coat. I started to order what I could. And finally I went past the gate, crossed away from the camp, went towards a house, which obviously a house of one of the officers of the guards. And I saw a nice pot there on the outside, one of the handles, says that would be good for me. So I want to put it in my pocket, and I hear somebody say, with a foreign accent, come in here. So I go in there and I find one of these Ukrainians there, already in possession, the gun next to him at the table, and drinking. He says to me, put that pot down. I said, no, why? I found it was outside, it's mine. He said, put it down, I'll shoot you. I said, no, I won't. And I turn around without looking back, and I walk straight back to the camp. I was in a line of sight for him for about 200 yards, I would say. And this is something that comes back to me all the time. I don't know why I did this. I still feel, as I talk about it, the point of his gun, like expecting the bullet to hit the middle of my back, not my head, back. I don't know why. The back is on it. That's what I feel, that feeling that the back is going to be shot at. I didn't turn around. I defied him. And as I look back, you know, some of the things I'm saying, this, of course, it crystallized in my mind as I got older. At that time, I don't know why I did it, but I would like to think that I did it because I felt at this point human again, equal. I wasn't any more a prisoner. I'm just as good as you are. I defied him for a pot that almost cost my life after all that suffering.
Woebelin was liberated by soldiers from the 82nd Airborne, and I had the chance to speak with several of them more than 20 years ago. Conley Shirley, Fred Frater, and Leonard Linton. One survivor referred to these American soldiers as our angels in khaki. They told me that when they saw the camp, it was as if at that moment they understood why they had fought the war. They told me that nothing they experienced in the war, and by then they thought they had seen everything, had prepared them for what they saw when they arrived at the camp. And here is a picture of my father the day of his liberation. So my father is over here, and you can actually see the coat that he mentioned when he spoke about the oversized coat that he had found. And he has the pot in his hand that he had mentioned taking from the porch of that house. The Americans sent my father to a hospital in Hamburg where he was treated lovingly by German nuns. After he had enough strength to leave the hospital, he eventually made his way back to Budapest in July or August of 1945. There he learned that his mother and sisters had survived the war, but his father had not. He was among the nearly 550,000 Hungarian Jews that had been killed in death camps in 1944 and 1945. My father also learned that he was the only child from Tiszavilak that survived the camps. Here's a picture of my father, and there's a picture of his best friend Jean, who I'd spoken about earlier. And everybody but my father was killed. After the war, my father spent 4 years in a sanitarium in Hungary, recovering from tuberculosis. He was smuggled out of then communist Hungary into Austria, and eventually went to Australia, where he lived for 9 years before reuniting with his family who had emigrated to the United States. Many of you might be wondering what happened to my father's guardian angel, Fritz, and whether my father ever saw him again. Well, in 1949, after my father was smuggled into Austria, he stopped in Vienna on his way to a displaced persons camp in Salzburg. My father found Fritz's address in a phone book, and he wrote to him from Salzburg. Although they never saw each other, my father held on to a letter that Fritz sent him just before my father left Salzburg for Australia. I'd like to read you some of that letter. Dearest Jean, my booby, I have received your letter of October 4th and your second letter. Can you imagine my joy when I suddenly got news from you, when I was already thinking you might not be alive anymore? Now I am happy from all my heart that Booby is alive and now is already a grown man. Dear Jean, I would have answered right away, but I wanted to surprise you and come to Salzburg. Now things happen differently, and time has not permitted me to go to Salzburg. So I am writing a few lines to tell you that I am the real Fritz who was with Booby. If you are still in Salzburg in December, I will pick you up and you will come spend a few weeks with me in Vienna. Dear Jean, my real name is Simon Umschweif, Vienna 19th District. Only everyone knows me by the name Fritz. Now I send my warmest regards from your good friend Fritz. Now, in the last few minutes that I have with you, I'd like to share a message that I know my father would want to convey if he were here with us today. After everything my father experienced, he would tell us that, unfortunately, he sees similarities between what happened in Europe in the 1930s and in his own village and what is happening now in this country and abroad. He would be deeply troubled by the rise of far-right white nationalist groups and their use of the internet and social media platforms to spread hate and lies about Jewish, Black, Latino, Asian, and Muslim people and other groups. He would be very concerned about the surge in hate crimes over the past few years, including horrific attacks against Jewish congregants in Pittsburgh, Muslim worshippers in a New Zealand mosque, Black worshippers in a Charleston church, and Latino shoppers in a Walmart in El Paso. Now, whether or not you believe there is a causal link between bigotry and violence, we can all agree that the dissemination of hate and intolerance has a corrosive effect on people and on this country. It creates mistrust and leads to prejudgment. It inhibits our ability to understand each other, to feel compassion for those that are different, and it leads to tribalism and an us versus them mentality. And it hurts those members of our communities and our country that are the targets of the hate. Try to imagine what it must feel like to be a Muslim American, every bit as American as any of us, who has had to deal with Islamophobia and mistrust since 9/11 or after subsequent terrorist attacks. Or put yourself in the shoes of an Asian American who is spat on and blamed for the coronavirus? And what about Latinos who have dealt with years of dehumanizing attacks against immigrants from Mexico, Central and South America, and who are in the crosshairs of the white nationalist groups? Words matter. They really matter, especially in the internet age. Words and lies spread quickly. They hurt, they alienate, they divide. They marginalize and they dehumanize the targets of the hate. They create scapegoats and they justify violence. So what my father would ask of all of us is this: do not judge anyone on the basis of their race, religion, nationality, gender, sexuality, or political views, or anything. Be kind, keep an open mind, give people a chance, and judge them by their character and actions towards others. And if he were here today, my father would ask us to confront racism and intolerance whenever we can. Don't become complacent or numb to it. Don't brush it off. If you hear someone use hate speech, especially someone you know, speak up. If someone shares a hateful or racist post, or if you are concerned about a friend who seems drawn to far-right social media, speak up. If you are walking on the street and you hear someone making an anti-Muslim comment to a woman wearing a hijab or to a Jewish man wearing a yarmulke, say something. If not to the person that made the remark, then at least offer kind words to the target of the hate. I am certainly not suggesting that these acts on their own will keep racism and prejudice in check. Far from it. But what I am suggesting is that your kindness and courage can have a significant impact on the person that inspired it. And I say that from personal experience. I went to Washington School and I loved my time there. I was the only Jewish person in my whole grade and probably the only Jew to play Santa Claus in the Washington School Christmas play. But my religion never mattered to my friends and classmates, and their religion never mattered to me. And I felt at home when I was a student there, except on one occasion. When I was in 4th or 5th grade, I was standing in line for the water fountain after gym class, and a boy said to me, "Hitler should have burned all of you in the ovens." I was stunned. But before I had a chance to open my mouth, my friends stared the boy down. And then they turned to me, and with compassion in their eyes, told me not to listen to him. I don't remember who made the offensive statement, but I do remember who defended me: Henry Walensky and Albert Rodriguez. When I was a freshman in high school, I was sitting at a table in the cafeteria when I felt something hitting me on my back, and then I saw pennies on the ground nearby. I was angry and humiliated and afraid, and I wasn't sure how to respond. Then I looked to my right, and a student that sat diagonally across from me, an upperclassman who I didn't know, looked at me and said, "Don't pay attention to them. They're ignorant," and he shook his head in disgust. I don't remember who threw the pennies, but I will never forget the young black student, who must have dealt with much worse than I ever did, that gave me comfort. That one moment, that one intervention meant so much to me, and it still does. So I'll close with this. Words mattered then, and words matter now. So please, everyone, speak up.